Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first edition of the Fantasy Premier League show, brought to you by your friends here at American Scouser TV. We are extremely excited to embark on our newest of programming for you, which will be a look into the EPL fantasy world. We're going to come to you each and every week. We'll have a show out by the time the lineups are predicted. We're going to have all kinds of segments, and we have time over the next few weeks as we lead into that. But we thought today we would introduce you to some of our, and I will say this loosely, experts. Um, Anyone who has been a fan or a follower, and as we've learned recently, we have both people who follow us and like us. To our weekly podcast, you'll know that we have a fantasy segment that we talk about and our varying opinions, not only on how to strategically set up your team, but our varied opinions on the opinion of the overall game itself. And we're going to get to that a little bit today. So today's going to be a little bit more of a discussion, and we're going to set the tone for what you can expect throughout the season. So with that, we're going to welcome in our first guest. You may have seen him on a podcast or two, some of our content in the past. He is wearing one of our very own Joel Matip going on an adventure custom American Scouser t-shirts. Well played by Mateusz. Well dropped by the host. I might have to give myself a little pat on the back for that one. But in all seriousness, Mateusz, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a blast to be a part of this and to provide some average to mediocre advice for anyone who's looking for it. So I'm happy to be here.
I love the fact that you did not overshoot that and you brought it in at our level, average and mediocre. And for anyone, as I mentioned before, that is a regular viewer of our podcast, they will know our next guest that is usually sitting in the host chair. Today, he is taking up the seat of analyst and or angriest person when it comes to the overall plight and play of fantasy soccer. So, Timucin, give us your 10,000-foot view on the good old fantasy EPL and say hello to our listeners.
Well, hello to everybody. I mean, it's nice to be on this chair. No wonder you guys are always like trying to get me to host, but it's kind of like nice to chill here and just be angry, which I will be whenever I'm on this fantasy show because there's a lot of things to be angry about.
Yeah, we're going to get deeper into some of that as well as some of your overall opinions on the sport, comparisons to others. But I thought I would start as our listeners get to know us a little bit better. We'll start with you, Mateusz. When it came to both, joining the fantasy EPL game and more importantly, kind of your exposure into fantasy sports, where did that start with you? I think everybody has a little different story for how they got into fantasy sports.
I feel like for me, it was about 11 years ago was when I first really started getting into fantasy sports. There used to be this website, it still exists. It's called Pro Sports Daily. And what they ended up doing in some aspects for certain sports, they would grab 30 different users on that on the website, and then you'd have your own draft of all the players, and then you could be able to trade with other managers, other owners, so to speak. That kind of where it all started for me. And then from there, after going off to college and then meeting a bunch of guys who were really into the NFL, not that I wasn't, it just wasn't a big part of my life. They had their own dynasty football league they like to do. And that idea to me sounded really fun, having a team that you control year in, year out, and you can't change unless you trade a player away to another owner, another manager. So that's what got me into the fantasy football aspect of it, which has been been the primary fantasy dealings that I've had in the last probably decade or so. And then probably about 3 years ago, I really wasn't too aware of Fantasy Premier League, to be honest. It was just one of those things I'd watch the games and I would just be in my own little bubble, and that was kind of it. And then it wasn't until Timucin kind of reached out to me a few years back about the American Scouser vision and idea, and then I saw some individuals playing the Fantasy Premier League here, and that's when I kind of started playing this aspect of fantasy football. So all in all, about a decade of fantasy sports and a decade of irrelevance for my position in said fantasy sports. So
beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing. For anyone that hasn't joined us yet, we'll put in the comment sections. We're going to have a league, and we're going to talk about that a little further during this episode. We're also going to make sure and share that information because it's an open league, and we welcome anyone who would like to be involved. We'll be giving the standings and updates on a monthly basis. We'll be tracking our contributors' successes and failures to succeed, as was how we tracked my plight last season, and we'll get a little bit further into that in a little bit as we look a little bit at our history. But more importantly than that, you can join our Discord channel as well. Our Discord channel, for anyone that doesn't know, is a supporters-based site. We have an entire channel within there completely dedicated to fantasy EPL, where we have guys talking about players and predictions and ways you can interact. Mateusz was definitely a lot more vocal in there last year. I think he was trying to actually figure out different ways to look at players and to kind of strategize around things. And ultimately, he really just wanted to run me down for being a big mouth and saying that I was good at this game. And for a while, it looked like he would. And then, like usual, he started running his mouth. And in this sport, that is a guaranteed surefire way to fail. If you doubt that, just check back out to a podcast in late August of last year where I ridiculed and laughed at people who said my wife would beat me. And, well, we will get to that as the podcast and episode proceeds. Timucin, as we come to you, our resident grump when it comes to all things fantasy soccer.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Don't worry.
I was like, wait, what? Fantasy? Yes.
I want to make sure we're not spreading any rumors here. We're completely talking the truth. But let's go ahead and start with you.
So I started fantasy probably I think more the American way. As a Turkish dude, I started the American way, just fantasy football, kind of liked football first when I came here for college. And then I got introduced to it at work. And honestly, it's like the competitiveness. Anything that's competitive, I'm going to be sucked right into it. So I started doing that. Honestly, having been a soccer person my entire life, I did not realize there was fantasy for soccer because I always felt it would not be as doable as football is, or some of the other American sports like basketball, because it's not as number oriented as perhaps football is, or like baseball is. I said baseball, but you guys know what I mean. So and then I started it obviously when we had the American Scouser website. I might have been like Jamie actually that just brought it up. We started our own league, and honestly, like I say, I'm only in it for the most part for competitive reasons. Do I like it? No, and that's why I'm the grump. I think obviously it's fun. Anytime it's competitive and we can talk shit to each other, that's part of the fun of like fantasy, any fantasy sports, because there's really nothing to. This year there will be, but usually there's really no big prizes to win or anything like that. And I enjoyed that aspect of it. I mean, we'll talk about this moving forward, but I think there's so many differences to fantasy football that makes it, I think, to me initially less enjoyable, but I'm kind of like learning it. It's totally different game. I think when I started it, I assumed it would be very similar to fantasy football. Apart from the fantasy parts, it really is not. There's a lot of differences and there's a lot of tweaks, and it's like the strategy that you use is totally different. So I think it's like a bigger learning curve, and that's why I think especially these first couple of episodes will be helpful to anybody looking to get started, because you're going to be in for a shock come week 5 if you just start and get out for the first time and not knowing some of the intricacies of the leagues.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to transition here, and we will get into some of those differences between the NFL and, of course, the EPL. Just so everyone is clear, for those watching on our YouTube streams, this is the fantasy game we're talking about. It's the official Premier League fantasy football game. There are a few different variations of it, so when we talk about the rules, the scoring, where you can find our league, we are so original here at American Scouser. We have come up with the awesome league name of American Scouser Cup 2022. So we will be sharing that code as well as the link to join. We're really excited. You can't see it here unless you zoom in, but I used a specific graphic just to infuriate the resident grump himself, because this team not only has Mo Salah, it has Son, and it has our good friend Christian Pulisic, the American, starting. And no one would start a Chelsea player on the wing, let alone Christian Pulisic. But I thought it would be fun just to see the cringe at the idea of Mo Salah and Christian Pulisic lining up in the same setup. Now, if it meant that Heung-min Son was on the team, I might tolerate Pulisic being on the team.
Yeah.
But that is the game that we're talking about. I'll give a quick overview of myself, and then we'll jump right into our conversation. For those of you who know me from the podcast, I am Gally. I've been an avid supporter of the Premier League about 10, 12 years. And I'll be honest, it was about then that I started to get into the fantasy Premier League. I think my first year was 2015 or 16. We will be transparent on this program. So if we're going to give you expert opinions, we will show you in the times in which we are experts and the times in which we are not. This is a historical run, and I'd have one of these for the other two gentlemen to bring up on screen if either one of them had registered a team by now at this point of the game. But seeing that they hadn't, so I started in 15, 16. Obviously, the game was much smaller then, so the rankings, the scoring has changed, where it used to be you had to be in the top 10,000. My best finish was 1920, where I finished just outside the first 10,000 in the game. My goal all year was to be top 10,000. I got as high as 8,800 with 2 weeks to go, and then I crashed and burned and dropped like a stone to fall outside of the top 10,000. But we will be looking at numbers. We'll talk about strategy and why we play this game. I realized last season that everyone else plays this game purely for my demise. And that, I guess, is a better visual, which is here is my wife, who only started playing the game because I make her watch a lot of football. She did better than everybody in our entire contributor channel and side last year, finishing 5th overall within the top 100,000. Week 17 of last year, my wife was 1,200 in the world out of 9.2 million people. And let me tell you, she was first in our house, and she reminded me that every day of the entire calendar year and still does now.
As she should.
If you would like to be a part of our league, get involved, join. You too can send me hate messages and or things or make fun of me at times. It'll be a lot of fun. Everyone will enjoy it. I said you too can send messages, and my dog from 2 rooms away just started barking out of excitement for the listeners sending in hate and or ridicule to my picks. But we're going to share a lot around strategy. We're going to share a lot around why, as well as how the points are scored, the different chips of the game. Because I think something Timucin mentioned is as you play the game, you learn more about kind of how the game is played and how the scoring happens. From the different chips to the different strategies to the different types of leagues. And with that, it's where I'd like to transition back to something that Timucin talked about. As an American, primarily an American audience here, I think the majority of folks have played or know of American fantasy football, which is normally a head-to-head league with a draft in a format. Let's start with you, Timucin. When you first were exposed or introduced to American fantasy football, was it with a closed group of people that you either worked with, were friends with, or was it people throughout the internet that were more, acquaintances or folks that you had never met before, similar to kind of like the league we're talking about starting?
No, it was actually a smaller group, and I thought that's what made it fun. And perhaps that's why initially I did not like the soccer one as much, because it was such a huge league. But once we started the banter amongst us as contributors, because to me, that's the fun parts. My wife hates me for this, but the whole joy of winning is being able to rip on the other one. Otherwise, what's the point of winning, right? So I think so we started as basically it was people at work, and probably not a good business decision by the store manager at the time. I was just like a department guy at the time because we definitely spent a lot of time talking fantasy as opposed to talking work. So it did definitely have efficiency overall. Not a good call there, but I thought that was like the fun part of it. It was a smaller league. It was head to head, and I think it was more like Mateusz talking. It's like there was a lot more of like a long haul feel to it. Like it wasn't a week by week thing. It was more like you're taking somebody on that week. So it was similar to the Premier League, right? Like you have an opponent. You kind of like look at it. You look at matchups. You're like, I got him this week. I don't have him this week. This is what I worry about this week. That was kind of like the fun part of it. I think the thing that got me over time as I got into more fantasy leagues, I think that kind of like backfired on me because I enjoyed it so much. I started getting into other leagues. And I think what happens is, and I know a lot of people have multiple teams can kind of like attest to it, you don't know who the hell to root for at one point. I mean, you can have one guy, he's on your team in two, but you're playing against him in another two. It's like, do you want him to do good? Do now? So towards the end, it really affects like how you play the game. The thing I like about this, like the Premier League one, reminds me more of like I started doing like a lot more FanDuel, where it's like a weekly thing. You pick a team based on salary and stuff. I think it's a lot more. The soccer one is a lot more closer to that in the way you kind of like build your roster because there's no draft or anything like that. But it's almost a combination where even though you kind of pick it by salary, it is at the same time for the long haul because you kind of stuck with those guys and you can only change a few at a time.
You have a lot of great points in there. There's some real similarities to how you build a team, and we should make note that there are two different versions of the Premier League fantasy. You can do a draft format where you do a closed league and everyone has to have different teams, so different players. We're talking about the main primary fantasy league where you're just building out a roster and the three of us will all have Mo Salah probably captain 25 of the 38 weeks. There are both sides of this, and we're talking about the traditional model, and we'll talk about the different leagues they have and how those compare and contrast to the overall sport. Mateusz, to some of Timucin's comments there with regards to how the team is built and kind of the comparison to the NFL, your experience when you first started, you mentioned getting into college and having the buddies that start at the league. Was it a get together, drink beers and have a draft, in person with a lot of banter with the guys? Was it, because you're young enough to be basically our kid if we really needed you to be? Was it more along the lines of on the internet and over some type of Zoom and chat that I probably would still be late for? Talk to us about your experience when you joined into fantasy yourself.
Initially, it was really simple to all get together because we were all in the same area. Since then, as we've all moved away and gone across the states in different areas, we do still try and get together over a Zoom, or at least have the apps that we use have microphones or has a voice chat in it. So at least some people will join through voice chat. Others will just try and join through a Zoom situation where we can actually see each other's faces. The biggest thing for that one was that we just love seeing someone lose, because they have what we have. We have last place punishments, and it has ranged from retaking the ACT to doing a 5K and a 2-2 with loser spray painted across your chest to taking a blow up doll to a date to Applebee's. Like, we've done kind of just the gamut of what these punishments are. And that's the best part of it, I think, is after all that banter, after the weekly stress, after all that's gone, you look at the last place person and you just enjoy it. It's just the blast. And I will say I have been in last place a few times, but I've never been in last place after the losers bracket, so to speak. So once the standings are out and we have 8 guys, the top 4 make the playoffs and the bottom 4 play each other in the losers playoff, so to speak. So if you win one of those games, you avoid the punishment. So you can be 5th place and still have to do the punishment if you end up losing the last 2 weeks just because of unlucky injuries or starters being sat, whatever the case might be. So I think overall, it's brought us. It gives us a reason to all get together again, especially when it's so difficult to get together, considering where we all are at this point in our lives. So I think that's kind of the most important thing, is just being able to have that camaraderie and have that sense of kind of going back 10 years ago and being in that time and place again. And I feel like sometimes people love reminiscing on something like that and enjoying that again.
By the way, I like how Mateusz only went back 10 years because of his age. Gally and I can probably go back a few decades to get there, but that's nice.
Yeah, unfortunately, my first experience in fantasy sports was in 1990 something, which is probably an experience prior to Mateusz. So we will get off that topic of age as we kind of break through here, because in this sport, honestly, it really is about strategy. And I think that's something that has been something that's always been fun for me. I loved learning more about different players. When I first got into all sports, I was, I loved numbers and I loved statistics. I loved where players' history stack them up against other players and teams. And when I started following the Premier League, I questioned whether, with the exposure we have over here and my overall knowledge of the sport, if I would ever know, the backup fullback at Burnley. And I'm so happy to say this year I don't have to know who the fucking backup fullback is at Burnley. But the truth of the matter is, like, this sport allowed me to learn a lot about different clubs and a lot about different teams. It also made watching all the different matches that much easier. And I think for so many people in fantasy sports, and when you talk about the explosion of the NFL, and you talk about the explosion of the Premier League, right? We always bring a couple things back to video games. We bring back to Madden being what truly made non-football playing kids believe they understood the sport of football. And I honestly believe in a lot of ways FIFA did that for a younger generation by teaching them about world football, about, clubs like Juventus and clubs like Ajax and players at different areas. And I think fantasy sports has taken that to a new level, because we live in a world, of YouTube clicks and subscriptions. And while we're on that, feel free quickly right now to pause this guy yapping, go to our page, and click the subscribe button so you can get automatic updates and notifications on all the other great content that we'll be putting out. And if you don't like what you heard, still subscribe and leave us a message, and we'll do our best to, continue to piss you off. So please leave those comments and all of the messages. We love the feedback, both sides. But when we talk about the sport itself, Timucin, I'm going to come to you with this. In the Premier League, there are two different styles of the EPL for league types. We have the traditional league, which is what we have always done, where you're playing against everyone in the world with a scoring ranking system. And then it breaks down by club, by mini leagues, by friends, or like our American Scouser private league. So there's also head-to-head leagues. And in those head-to-head leagues, you're still managing a set team, the same team as you have. But you're pitted against a 1-to-1 opponent every week with a standings and then a playoffs at the end. Do you feel personally getting involved in a league like that might make someone like you that's a little bit more critical of the format and the overall approach make this a little bit more appealing of a game because of that close knit and the banter that could happen week to week among the league members?
I think that's the biggest thing. More than the format, it becomes the banter, and it becomes, who you're going against. If I'm playing you or Mateusz or, Bickler or whoever, it's going to be more stakes. I mean, I think the bigger leagues, the thing that I felt different when I first started it is when you have a rough week, it doesn't feel as painful as, for example, losing to Mateusz would be if you have a painful week. You know what I mean? Because you get to hear about it. Otherwise, you just don't get to hear about it as much. And one of the reasons I normally, the first 2 seasons I believe I played, this might have been my last season might have been my third. I probably somewhere through the middle, I just let it go. Like, you forgot 1 week and then you were like, and that's another topic for another episode, how the freaking Premier League does the lineup setup times and all that kind of stuff. Don't get me started on that. So I'll say that grump for another day. But I think you forget 1 league, and then once you fall, I don't know, like the 50th or 80th or whatever, it's a lot easier to kind of like let it go and be like, ugh, I'm not gonna have time for that. Whereas I think the weekly thing, when we were monitoring it last year, I mean, honestly, I was only doing my team so that it doesn't look bad on the podcast against you bozos, especially like with Bickler and stuff. So I think that in that sense, it becomes familiarity when it's head to head. So it brings that back. I think that's like the biggest thing of this league, and I think that's part of like the reason why we're doing the show and like trying to get like American Scouser fans to be in the league and stuff. So there's some more of a sense of a community, even if it is 200 people. I think that's about how many we had last year. So even if it is 400, 500, weekly we'll get to record the scores, like who did really good and stuff like that. So maybe bring a couple of people on, they can join like with the comments and stuff like that. Down the road, we'll probably do some live shows too. So I think that's kind of like the fun part of it, is the community part of it. But the head to head, to answer your question, I think would make it more fun for me, because it really emphasizes the banter behind the whole thing.
Yeah, and when we start to really look at the standings, and we kind of do our updates each week or monthly, however we decide to do it, we're going to make sure to not just highlight who had a great week last week or who might have be at the top of the standings. We're going to look at monthly standings so that there's opportunities for folks to be engaged. We might even start a segment or two at times where we have viewers send in their lineups or their teams, basically like a team reveal. And these bozos and dopes will tell you their opinions on it. Most likely, it'll probably be me telling you that I wouldn't have picked up that player, which will mean by default that player will haul for a good score of 15 to 20, while the guy that I recommend instead will probably get a red card within 5 minutes or be subbed off 3 minutes on, or 2 minutes before the 60th minute mark, so he loses a clean sheet. That's the type of shit that happens to Galley, and that's why his wife has beaten him 4 of the last 6 years in fantasy sports.
This show is going to be a long list of excuses.
Should we just rename the show to Excuses by Galley?
It's not excuses. Excuses would be coming up with reasons to say, or kind of telling you that the ideas I have. This show should be basically renamed to Musings by Galley, where he just admits to his own failure and the fact that he's still going to talk from a position of some form of expert status, even though he is basically just an expert at finishing second. But I do think we're going to have to come up with a legitimate losers bet for our American Scouser head-to-head league. I don't know what that will be yet. It might be something like an Everton jersey parade. It might be something like you might have to wear a Richarlison jersey out in public, and a sign that says, "Can I have your jersey, Richarlison?" Oh wait, some little girl has already had her life ruined by being on American Scouser TV with that image on the screen.
You've got to make sure it's an Everton Richarlison, though, because I could see myself going, okay, I will just get the Tottenham one, and it won't be as bad.
It is true. It could be worse. It could be a Brazil one.
So I don't know.
Yeah, it's still Richarlison. It is still Richarlison. But I'd made the joke earlier of the old bet we had in our fantasy basketball league that the loser had to get a Doug Christie jersey and wear it around. And I had to fill everyone in here. These guys weren't aware that has been a long-standing running kind of gag gift for loser of fantasy leagues, based on Doug Christie's status of traveling only with his wife on road trips and basically being one of the more whipped people in the entire world. So Doug Christie, if you're listening to this, and I know you are, we're going to give out a Doug Christie. We'll send a Doug Christie jersey to you. Mateusz, before we wrap things up here, give me one thing that you are most looking forward to sharing with our viewers, our listeners, etc., moving forward as we get ready for the season that starts at the beginning of August.
The one thing I'm most excited about is I think just being able to provide information to a community that's looking for that information. I think there's a lot of room to also help us personally develop and grow and understand the game a bit better, because as you said, we're not the experts by any means. We can be the experts on this show, but in the general consensus of fantasy, we're probably not the best experts. So just being able to be part of a community where we can bounce things back off of one another and grow with our viewers as well as ourselves. I think that's something that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, it's a great point there. And Timucin, for you, something you're looking forward to, and I mean, for me, it's basically just you bitching. That's what I'm most looking forward to. It's
That's what I'm
basically
looking forward to.
giving you shit about that. So something other than your weekly rants as we lead up. Is there anything you're hoping that other beginners to the sport or people that are just first getting into it and learning more about the scoring, the kind of team building, anything like that you're hoping to get out of this or be able to share with people as we build up and ramp up towards the season?
Taking the bitching out of the equation really eliminates a lot of stuff, I would say. But aside from like being the grumpy old man in the corner, I think my main goal is to, if someone told me when I first started some of the things that we want to share, especially over the next few weeks, in terms of like the rules and coming up with the strategies and stuff like that, I think I would enjoy my first couple of seasons a lot more. Because some of the things I found out halfway through, it felt like, and by then it's too freaking late. So I think my biggest goal is, to be able to provide a platform to the community and people who are interested and who are in the league or not in the league, just interested in getting into the fantasy league in the general. Because I mean, I'm a soccer junkie, and this kind of like only soccer competitive banter, sign me up kind of an ordeal. So I think the biggest thing would be like providing some information to people so that they can enjoy it more by having a lot of information that a bozo like me didn't have going into it. So I think that would be really helpful.
I'm definitely looking forward to you calling yourself a bozo and old more often, because that just makes the jokes that much easier. But we really are really excited to bring more content through American Scouser TV. We're excited to be able to branch out and talk about more than just the Liverpool Football Club that all of you who have been engaged with us for years know is our true passion. But that passion spreads across the Premier League, spreads across gambling, interviews with different folks. So, Timucin, before we go, let them all know one more time where are they going to go, what are they going to do?
Oh, hold on. I told my daughter I would say this, and I was banned from saying it, so I'm going to say it anyway. Smash the subscribe button, because I'm letting the kids say it. Yeah, see? See, the young people know. So, yeah, just go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and definitely give us feedback. I think that's the most important thing, aside from like subscribing and stuff.
Don't forget to like and share, make your comments, bring your friends to this show if you think that it is something they will enjoy, if you think that it's something that they will be able to learn from. Join our league, send us in your teams if there's segments or topics you want to hear about, things that we're not covering. But just so you're aware, we will be back every week leading up to the season. Our next few episodes will be more specifically formatted around the rules, strategy around putting together your first team. We are going to go through all the scoring, as well as some of the strategies around the usage of the chips, whether it be the wild card, the bench boost. Those are things that, the professional players are thinking about a month to a month and a half in advance. So if there are topics like that you want to hear more about, please leave us a comment. Give us a like. If you enjoyed the video, please share it with your friends. And most of all, have a great time playing Fantasy EPL this upcoming season. And I'm Gally, and I hope you all have a great week.